Ethan Parker had exactly $17 left in his bank account, and his final medical school payment was due in 3 days. If he missed another shift, he wasn't sure he could stay enrolled. So on a cold Dallas night, after 10 exhausting hours at the hospital, the poor black medical student was running through a storm to get to his second job. Then he saw an elderly man collapse in the middle of the street while pushing his wife in a wheelchair. Everyone else kept driving. Ethan stopped. What he didn't know was that saving those 2 strangers would reopen a 25-year secret that had already destroyed his mother's life, and expose a corruption scandal powerful people had spent decades trying to bury. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. The rain arrived without warning. One moment, downtown Dallas shimmered beneath the glow of streetlights and office towers. The next, thick clouds rolled across the sky and opened like a broken dam, sending sheets of water crashing onto the streets below. 25-year-old Ethan Parker pulled the hood of his faded navy jacket tighter around his head and quickened his pace. He was tall, lean, and athletic from years of long shifts spent on his feet. His dark brown skin glistened with rain, and his short black curls were already soaked despite the hood. Most people who met Ethan noticed his calm eyes first. They were the eyes of someone who listened more than he spoke. Someone who had learned early in life that complaining rarely changed anything. He checked the time on his phone. 8:18 p.m. His shift at the convenience store started in 42 minutes. He couldn't afford to be late. Not anymore. Medical school wasn't supposed to be this hard. At least that's what he'd believed when he was 18. Back then, becoming a doctor felt like a dream worth chasing. 7 years later, the dream was still alive, but it came with crushing student loans, endless hospital rotations, sleepless nights, and bills that never seemed to stop arriving. His mother, Linda Parker, worked 2 jobs despite being in her 50s. Ethan hated that. Every month he promised himself things would get better after graduation. Every month he watched her leave for work before sunrise. The thought pushed him forward through the storm. As he crossed a busy intersection, something unusual caught his attention. About 50 yards ahead, an elderly man was struggling against the rain. At first, Ethan kept walking. Then he noticed the wheelchair. The old man was pushing a woman through the storm. The wheelchair wheels kept catching in puddles, while the wind shoved both of them sideways. Ethan slowed. The man looked to be around 78. He had thick silver hair combed neatly back despite the weather, broad shoulders that suggested he had once been strong, and a square jaw framed by a trimmed white beard. Even from a distance, there was a dignity about him. He carried himself like someone accustomed to responsibility, someone who had spent his life solving problems instead of asking for help. The woman in the wheelchair appeared slightly younger. Her silver hair rested just above her shoulders, and her pale face showed both intelligence and exhaustion. Despite the rain soaking her coat, she sat upright with remarkable composure. The kind of woman who had probably spent a lifetime refusing to let hardship define her. Ethan glanced at his phone again. 39 minutes. He kept walking. Then everything changed. The old man suddenly stopped. One hand flew to his chest. His knees buckled. "No," Ethan whispered. The man collapsed onto the pavement. The wheelchair rolled forward a few feet before stopping. The woman cried out, "Robert!" Cars continued driving past. Nobody stopped. The rain swallowed her voice. Ethan didn't even remember deciding to move. 1 second he was standing on the sidewalk. The next he was sprinting through the storm. By the time he reached them, the old man was struggling to breathe. "Sir, can you hear me?" Ethan asked. The man nodded weakly. His face had turned pale. His breathing was shallow. One hand remained pressed against the center of his chest. Years of medical training immediately took over. Chest pain, shortness of breath, sweating, sudden collapse, possible myocardial infarction, heart attack. The woman gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. Her knuckles turned white. "Please help him," she pleaded. "Please, I'm going to try." Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed 911. While speaking with dispatch, he assessed Robert's condition. The symptoms matched what he feared. The dispatcher informed him an ambulance was on the way, but Ethan knew minutes mattered, every minute. He removed his jacket and folded it beneath Robert's head. "Stay with me, sir." Robert's eyes flickered open. "You a doctor?" he asked weakly. "Not yet." A faint smile appeared. "Close enough." Despite the situation, Ethan almost laughed. The old man had spirit. The woman introduced herself between anxious breaths. "My name is Margaret." Ethan nodded. "I'm Ethan." Margaret never looked away from her husband. The fear in her eyes reminded him of countless family members he'd seen during hospital rotations. That helpless feeling. Watching someone you love suffer while being unable to stop it. He knew it well. When Ethan was 12, Linda had collapsed from exhaustion after working a double shift. He still remembered the terror. The ambulance sirens finally pierced the storm. Relief washed through him. Paramedics rushed toward them. Within moments, Robert was loaded onto a stretcher. A gray-haired emergency physician who had arrived with the crew reviewed Ethan's assessment. The doctor looked impressed. "You caught this early." Ethan shrugged. "I got lucky." "No," the physician replied. "You paid attention." He glanced toward the ambulance. 5 or 10 more minutes and this could have been a very different night. The words lingered in Ethan's mind. A very different night. Margaret reached for his hand before the ambulance doors closed. Rainwater mixed with tears on her face. "Thank you." Ethan didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. Then the ambulance disappeared into the storm. Only after it was gone did he realize the time. 9:11 p.m. His stomach dropped. He was over 30 minutes late. Still, he ran to work. The convenience store manager didn't care about heart attacks. He didn't care about ambulances. He didn't care about old couples stranded in storms. The man barely listened before cutting Ethan off. "You missed your shift. There was an emergency." "Not my emergency." Ethan stared at him. The manager folded his arms. "Turn in your badge." The walk home felt longer than usual. The rain had stopped, but his future suddenly felt heavier. By the time he reached the apartment, Linda was waiting. At 52, Linda Parker remained striking despite years of hardship. She was an African-American woman with deep brown skin, intelligent eyes, and short natural curls touched with gray. There was strength in her posture and sharpness in her gaze that hinted at the successful professional she had once been. Life had taken almost everything from her except her dignity. "You lost the job," she said quietly. Ethan sighed. "How did you know?" "A mother knows." He laughed despite himself. Then he told her everything. The old man, the wheelchair, the ambulance, the heart attack. When he finished, Linda was silent for a long moment. Finally, she smiled. "I'm proud of you." Ethan looked away. Those words always hit harder than he expected. The next morning began like any other, until the SUVs arrived. 3 black luxury SUVs rolled onto the street and stopped directly in front of their apartment building. Neighbors stepped outside. Curtains moved. People stared. Ethan and Linda stood frozen by the window. Several men in suits exited first. Then an elderly woman appeared, Margaret, still in her wheelchair. But now she looked completely different, elegant, confident, powerful. A man stepped out beside her, Robert, alive, standing. A little weaker than before, but smiling. The sight brought unexpected relief to Ethan. The couple approached the apartment. Moments later, they were sitting in the Parker family's small living room. Margaret looked around carefully, then her eyes settled on Linda. Everything changed. The color drained from her face. For several seconds she didn't speak. She simply stared, as if she were looking at someone she had not seen in decades. Linda looked equally stunned. "Margaret?" she whispered. Margaret's hand tightened on the armrest. "Oh my God." Robert looked between the two women. "You know each other?" Neither answered immediately. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, heavier. Finally, Margaret spoke. "After all these years," Ethan frowned. "What is going on?" Margaret slowly turned toward him, but before she could answer, Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. His gaze moved from Linda to Ethan, then back again. "I came here today because your son saved my life," he said. His voice was steady. "But standing in this room," he paused. A strange look crossed his face. "As unbelievable as it sounds, I think that may be the least important reason we're here." The silence that followed seemed to swallow the entire room. The silence in the Parker family's small living room lasted several seconds after Robert Sullivan spoke. Ethan looked from his mother to Margaret, trying to understand what was happening. He had never seen Linda Parker look surprised before. Life had taught her to expect disappointment, betrayal, and hardship. Surprise was a luxury she rarely allowed herself. Yet now she sat motionless. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Linda Parker," she said softly. "I haven't heard that name in 25 years. Linda let out a slow breath. I was beginning to think nobody remembered it. Robert looked between them. "You really know each other?" Margaret nodded. "I never met Linda personally back then, but everyone in Texas finance knew who she was." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Margaret glanced toward him. "It means your mother was once one of the most respected forensic auditors in the state." Ethan stared at Linda. For a moment he thought Margaret must be mistaken. His mother worked warehouse jobs. She cleaned office buildings. She spent weekends stocking shelves at a grocery store. He had never imagined people once respected her. Linda noticed the confusion on his face. A sad smile appeared. "I never talked much about it." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "You didn't." Margaret leaned forward in her wheelchair. 25 years earlier, Linda Parker had been a rising star in financial auditing. She was known for her attention to detail and her refusal to bend rules for powerful people. Those qualities earned admiration from honest colleagues and resentment from dishonest ones. Then she uncovered something enormous, a network of fraudulent accounts connected to several charitable organizations and corporate foundations across Texas. Millions of dollars intended for public programs had vanished. Linda reported everything. She expected an investigation. Instead, she became the target. Witnesses disappeared, documents vanished. Executives denied everything. Soon rumors spread that Linda had fabricated evidence. Within months, she lost her position. Within a year, nobody would hire her. Ethan listened in stunned silence. For most of his life, he had assumed poverty was simply their reality. Now he realized it had been forced upon them. Robert shook his head slowly. "You sacrificed everything." Linda gave a small shrug. "I told the truth, and they punished you for it. They made sure everyone else saw what happened." The room grew quiet again. Robert's expression hardened. As a businessman, he had seen greed many times. But hearing what had happened to Linda angered him. Not because of money, because of principle. The woman sitting across from him had lost 25 years of her life for doing the right thing. Margaret reached into a leather folder resting on her lap. "That's one reason I came here." She placed several documents on the table. "The other reason is that my foundation has a problem." Linda adjusted her glasses and looked down. The documents belonged to the Sullivan Hope Foundation, one of the largest charitable medical organizations in Texas. For years, it had funded treatment programs, children's hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and emergency assistance grants. Margaret pointed toward several highlighted transactions. "We've lost millions over the past few years." "How much?" Linda asked. Margaret hesitated. "More than $12 million. Ethan's eyebrows rose. Even Robert looked uncomfortable hearing the number. Linda quietly began reading. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nobody interrupted her. Finally, she sat back. Her expression had changed. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Linda tapped one page. "The pattern." Margaret leaned forward. "What pattern? I've seen it before." The room became still. Linda pointed at several transfers. Money left the foundation, moved through consulting companies, then through management firms, then through vendors. Eventually, the trail disappeared. On paper, everything looked legitimate. But to an experienced auditor, the structure was familiar. Too familiar. "The same thing happened 25 years ago," Linda said. Robert's face darkened. "You think it's connected?" "I think whoever designed this understood exactly how investigations work." Margaret exchanged a glance with her husband. Neither liked the answer. Later that afternoon, after the Sullivans left, Ethan drove to the hospital for his clinical rotation. His thoughts remained fixed on the conversation. The image of his mother reviewing financial records lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, she had looked alive, focused, purposeful, like the woman she used to be. At the hospital, Ethan worked under Dr. Samuel Green. Dr. Green was a 62-year-old cardiologist with silver hair, warm blue eyes, and a reputation for treating every patient with respect regardless of wealth. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother because medical treatment came too late. Since then, compassion had become the foundation of his practice. Near the end of the shift, Ethan reviewed patient assistance files. One case caught his attention. Then another, then a third. Several low-income patients had been denied financial support. Yet the records showed foundation funds had already been distributed on their behalf. Ethan frowned. That didn't make sense. He approached a social worker named Karen Mills. Karen was a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and tired eyes that reflected years spent helping struggling families. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Sure." He showed her the file. Karen immediately recognized the name. The family never received a dime. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, but it says they did. Karen nodded. "I know. How many cases like this?" She hesitated. "More than I'd like." The answer stayed with Ethan long after his shift ended. That evening, he returned home carrying copies of several publicly available records. Linda was sitting at the kitchen table. For the first time in years, stacks of financial documents surrounded her. Ethan placed his papers beside hers. "I think I found something." Linda examined the files. Her eyes narrowed. The same reaction she'd had earlier. Neither spoke for several minutes. Eventually, she looked up. "This is bigger than I thought." Before Ethan could respond, his phone vibrated. "An unfamiliar number," he answered. A calm male voice greeted him. "This is Michael Sullivan." Ethan immediately recognized the name. Margaret and Robert's son, the heir to the foundation. "I'd like to meet." The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at a downtown office tower. Michael Sullivan was waiting inside. Unlike his father, Michael projected control rather than warmth. At 48, he was tall and athletic, with neatly styled dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. His expensive suit fit perfectly. His smile looked practiced. Everything about him suggested success. Everything about him suggested caution. He invited Ethan to sit. "I understand my parents have taken an interest in you." Ethan remained silent. Michael folded his hands. "My family appreciates what you did for my father. You're welcome. But some people have a habit of seeing problems where none exist." The room suddenly felt colder. Michael's smile remained. His eyes did not. "My mother mentioned Linda Parker." Ethan didn't answer. Michael leaned back. "She made serious accusations years ago. She told the truth." Michael's expression barely changed. "That's one version of events." Ethan felt anger rising. He forced himself to stay calm. Michael stood and walked toward the window overlooking Dallas. "The Sullivan Foundation helps thousands of people every year. Then why are patients missing funds?" The question hung between them. For the first time, Michael stopped smiling. Slowly, he turned around. The polished executive mask slipped for just a second. Just long enough for Ethan to notice, and just long enough to confirm that Michael Sullivan did not want Linda Parker anywhere near those records. Ethan Parker could not stop thinking about Michael Sullivan's face. The words had been calm. The tone had been polite. Yet something behind the man's eyes had changed the moment Ethan mentioned missing patient funds. That look stayed with him for days. The following week, Ethan spent every free hour outside the hospital tracking down families whose names appeared in the Foundation's records. On paper, they had received assistance. In reality, many had received nothing. The first family lived in a small neighborhood south of Dallas. Mrs. Teresa Martinez answered the door holding a stack of unpaid medical bills. She was a 58-year-old Hispanic woman with tired eyes, graying dark hair, and the posture of someone carrying burdens far heavier than her small frame should have endured. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, leaving her to care for her grandson alone. Inside the modest home, Ethan met 14-year-old Diego Martinez. The boy sat quietly on a couch beside an oxygen machine. He suffered from a severe heart condition. According to Foundation records, over $40,000 had been approved for his treatment. Teresa stared at Ethan when he showed her the paperwork. "We never saw any of that money." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Not even part of it?" She slowly shook her head. "I begged for help. They told us funding wasn't available." Ethan looked around the room. The peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the oxygen machine that seemed older than the boy using it. For the first time, the missing money stopped feeling like numbers on a spreadsheet. It felt personal. Over the next several days, the stories continued. A disabled veteran named Frank Delaney had been denied rehabilitation funding after losing part of his leg during military service overseas. Frank was 63 years old, broad-shouldered despite age, with weathered skin and a gray beard that covered old scars along his jaw. Years of hardship had made him cautious around strangers, but when Ethan showed him the Foundation records, bitterness appeared in his eyes. "They approved my case," Frank said. "That's what the records show. They told me the money ran out." The anger in his voice wasn't directed at Ethan. It was directed at years of disappointment, at promises made and broken, at doors closed. Every conversation deepened Ethan's conviction. Someone wasn't merely stealing money. Someone was stealing chances. Across town, Linda Parker was discovering the same truth through entirely different evidence. Stacks of financial reports covered the dining table. For the first time in decades, she felt the familiar rhythm of investigative work returning. Patterns, connections, inconsistencies. Most people looked at financial records and saw numbers. Linda saw behavior. She saw decisions. She saw intent. One evening, Robert Sullivan arrived carrying 3 additional boxes of Foundation records. The 78-year-old businessman looked stronger than he had during the storm. His recovery was progressing well, though traces of fatigue remained visible around his eyes. He placed the boxes on the table. "These came from archived storage." Linda looked surprised. "Michael approved this?" Robert hesitated. "No." That answer concerned everyone in the room. Ethan glanced toward him. "What happens if he finds out?" Robert sighed. "At this point, I'm more concerned about what happens if he doesn't." Over the following hours, Linda reviewed thousands of transactions. Then suddenly she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. She reached for another document, then another. A familiar feeling crept into her chest. Not fear, recognition. 25 years earlier, she had discovered a network of shell companies used to move charitable funds through multiple organizations before making the money disappear. Now she was seeing the same structure again. The names were different, the paperwork was newer, but the architecture remained identical. Someone had simply modernized the scheme. Linda began writing notes, company names, dates, transfer paths. As midnight approached, a disturbing picture emerged. The fraud wasn't random. It was organized, disciplined, professional. Someone with experience had built it. The next morning, Robert requested a private meeting with his son. Michael Sullivan arrived at Foundation headquarters shortly after noon. The executive boardroom overlooked downtown Dallas through massive glass windows. Michael entered carrying a tablet and wearing another perfectly tailored suit. Everything about him suggested confidence. But Robert had known his son for 48 years. He noticed things others missed. The slight tension in Michael's shoulders, the irritation hidden beneath the smile, the impatience. "What's this about?" Michael asked. Robert studied him carefully. "When was the last time you reviewed Foundation audits personally?" The question seemed simple, yet Michael's expression hardened almost immediately. "We have entire departments for that." "That's not what I asked." A long silence followed. Michael slowly placed the tablet on the table. "Dad, what's really going on?" Robert didn't answer immediately. The room felt colder than before. Finally he spoke. "Linda Parker thinks someone is stealing from the Foundation." Michael laughed. The sound felt forced. "A woman who hasn't worked in finance for 25 years? Robert remained silent. Michael's smile disappeared. "You actually believe her?" "I believe facts." For a brief moment, anger flashed across Michael's face. Then it vanished, replaced by composure. But Robert had already seen enough. That evening he left the meeting more troubled than before. Back at the Parker apartment, Linda continued reviewing records long after Ethan fell asleep. The clock showed nearly 2 in the morning. Most people would have stopped hours ago. Linda couldn't. Something was bothering her. One document, one transaction, one signature. Her eyes returned to a consulting contract from 6 years earlier. A name appeared near the bottom. The moment she saw it, her entire body froze. The room seemed to disappear around her. She read it again, then again. There could be no mistake. 25 years had passed, yet she remembered the name perfectly. Victor Langford, a former financial executive, a powerful figure who had publicly discredited her investigation decades earlier. The man whose testimony had destroyed her credibility. The man whose statements had effectively ended her career. And now his name appeared inside the Sullivan Foundation's financial network. Linda stared at the document. For the first time since this investigation began, she felt genuinely afraid. Because if Victor Langford was involved, then whatever they were uncovering was far bigger than anyone had imagined. The story broke on a Monday morning. By noon, Linda Parker's name was trending across Texas for the first time in 25 years. Unfortunately, it wasn't because of the truth. It was because someone wanted to bury it again. Ethan first saw the article while sitting in the hospital cafeteria. The headline filled his phone screen. "Former outer accused of false claims parts to Trek at Texas Charities." Below it appeared an old photograph of Linda from decades earlier. The article painted her as a disgraced conspiracy theorist whose accusations had nearly destroyed several organizations before ultimately being dismissed. Ethan's jaw tightened. Every word felt carefully designed, not to inform, to discredit. By evening, more articles appeared. Television commentators repeated the same talking points. Social media accounts spread identical accusations. Someone was spending serious money. Someone was scared. Back at the apartment, Linda sat quietly at the kitchen table reading the attacks. Her face remained calm, too calm. Ethan knew his mother well enough to recognize the difference. She wasn't calm, she was hurt. 25 years earlier, the same machine had destroyed her life. The same headlines, the same accusations, the same lies. Only now the internet could spread them faster. "You don't have to read those," Ethan said. Linda folded the newspaper. "I've read worse." "But it bothers you," she smiled sadly. "It always bothers you when people lie, Ethan." The next attack arrived 2 days later. This time the target was him. A formal complaint appeared at the medical school. The accusation claimed Ethan had improperly accessed confidential patient information while conducting unauthorized investigations connected to the Sullivan Foundation. The complaint triggered an internal review. By Thursday afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting across from Dean Rebecca Monroe. Rebecca Monroe was a woman in her early 60s, with silver blonde hair cut neatly at shoulder length and sharp gray eyes that missed very little. She had spent 30 years in academic medicine and had built a reputation for fairness. Students respected her because she listened before reaching conclusions. Unfortunately, rules were still rules. "Ethan," she said gently, "until this review is complete, your clinical privileges are suspended." The words hit harder than he expected. Suspended? Temporarily. I'm 3 months from graduation. I know. The dean looked genuinely sympathetic, but sympathy could not change policy. Ethan walked out of her office feeling as though years of sacrifice were slipping away. Medical school, night jobs, student debt, missed holidays. Everything suddenly felt fragile. That evening he sat alone in his car outside the hospital parking garage. For the first time since this began, fear started to outweigh determination. Maybe Michael Sullivan was right. Maybe some people were too powerful to fight. Across town, Robert Sullivan was fighting his own battle. The evidence continued to grow. Every new document pointed in the same direction. Every transaction led back toward Michael. Robert hated what he was seeing. Not because he doubted the facts, because he believed them. At 78, Robert had spent a lifetime building businesses and reading people. His greatest source of pride had always been his family. Now that same family was breaking apart. One evening, he invited Michael to dinner at the family estate. The large dining room felt strangely cold despite the expensive surroundings. Neither man touched much of the food. Finally, Robert slid several financial reports across the table. Michael glanced at them, then looked away. "You've been investigating me." The statement wasn't a question. Robert nodded. "I'm investigating missing money." Michael laughed bitterly. "You always taught me loyalty mattered." "It does. Then why are you doing this?" Robert looked at his son for a long moment. Because beneath the anger, he still saw the little boy who used to follow him around construction sites wearing oversized hard hats. The little boy who wanted to make him proud. "I keep asking myself the same thing." Michael's face hardened. "If you continue this, you'll destroy everything." Robert answered quietly. "No. If these documents are true, that already happened." The silence between them felt endless. Michael stood first. When he spoke again, his voice carried no warmth. "If you choose them over your family, don't expect forgiveness." Robert watched him leave. The words hurt, but not as much as the evidence. The following day, Margaret finally revealed something she had hidden for years. She sat with Linda and Ethan inside the Parker apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The sound reminded everyone of the night that started this journey. "I never told Robert the full story," she said. Linda looked surprised. Margaret took a slow breath. 22 years ago, I was preparing to present findings from an internal review of foundation finances. The room grew quiet. I believed someone inside the organization was stealing money. Ethan immediately sat forward. "What happened?" Margaret lowered her eyes. 3 days before the presentation, my car was hit by a truck." The words landed heavily. "The police called it an accident." Linda said nothing. Margaret continued. "I spent months in rehabilitation. By the time I recovered, the investigation was gone." Her hand rested lightly on the wheelchair, and so was my ability to walk. No one spoke for several moments. The possibility hanging in the room was too disturbing. What if it hadn't been an accident? What if someone had silenced her? That question lingered long after the conversation ended. Then, late Friday evening, everything changed. A knock sounded at the apartment door. Ethan opened it. An older man stood outside holding a weathered cardboard box. He appeared to be in his late 60s, thin and slightly stooped, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His face carried the exhausted look of someone who had spent years carrying secrets. "My name is Harold Bennett," he said. Linda immediately froze. She recognized the name. Harold Bennett had once worked as a senior accountant within one of the organizations connected to the original scandal. For decades, he had vanished. Nobody knew where he went. Harold slowly entered the apartment. Then he placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside sat folders, hundreds of pages, original contracts, bank records, internal memos, documents older than Ethan himself. Harold looked directly at Linda. "I should have come forward years ago." His voice trembled. "I was afraid." Linda opened one folder, then another. The documents were authentic. There was no question. Names, signatures, transfers, everything. Enough evidence to reopen investigations that had been buried for decades. Enough evidence to destroy careers. Enough evidence to expose the truth. An hour later, Robert Sullivan arrived. Harold showed him the records. Robert reviewed them in silence. Page after page, transaction after transaction, each one pushing him closer to a decision he never wanted to make. Finally, he stood. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, from heartbreak. He gathered every document together and placed them in front of Linda. When he spoke, his voice sounded older than ever before. "If we do this," he said, "there's no going back." Linda met his eyes. "No, there isn't." Robert looked toward the window. For a moment, he seemed to see his son as a child again. Then he closed his eyes. When he opened them, the hesitation was gone. "Take everything." The room fell silent. because everyone understood what had just happened. Robert Sullivan had finally chosen the truth, even if it meant standing against his own son. The Grand Regency Ballroom in downtown Dallas had hosted governors, senators, business leaders, and celebrities over the years. On that evening, it hosted something none of them expected. The annual Sullivan Hope Foundation Gala was the most important charity event in Texas. Hundreds of guests filled the enormous ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers. Television cameras lined the walls. Journalists occupied the rear sections. Wealthy donors sat at round tables covered in white linen. At the center of it all stood Michael Sullivan. The 48-year-old executive looked confident as he approached the stage. His tailored black tuxedo fit perfectly. His posture was relaxed. His smile seemed effortless. To everyone watching, he looked like a man about to inherit an empire. For Michael, the evening represented victory. The investigation had stalled. Ethan Parker's medical career was hanging by a thread. Linda Parker's reputation had once again been dragged through the mud. Robert and Margaret Sullivan had become increasingly isolated. Everything seemed under control. As applause filled the room, Michael stepped behind the podium. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate the future of healthcare philanthropy in Texas." More applause followed. Then a voice interrupted. "Before we discuss the future, perhaps we should discuss the past." The room immediately fell silent. Every head turned. Margaret Sullivan appeared near the entrance. Her wheelchair moved slowly down the center aisle. Beside her walked Robert Sullivan, and beside them were Linda Parker and Ethan Parker. The atmosphere changed instantly. Michael's smile vanished. Several members of the board exchanged nervous glances. Margaret stopped near the stage. Her voice remained calm. "I have something important to share with our donors." Michael gripped the podium. "This isn't the time." "Actually," Robert replied, "it's exactly the time." The tension became impossible to ignore. Television cameras immediately focused on the confrontation. One reporter whispered into her microphone. Something historic was unfolding. Michael attempted to regain control. "These accusations have already been addressed." Linda stepped forward. "No, Michael. They were buried." For a moment the room became completely still. Then Linda began speaking. At 52 years old, she had spent decades being ignored, decades being mocked, decades being called a liar, yet her voice never shook. One by one, she presented the evidence. The original records preserved by Harold Bennett, the financial transfers, the shell companies, the consulting contracts, the signatures, the timelines. The audience watched enormous projection screens as documents appeared behind her, each piece connected to the next. Each transaction led toward the same network, and each network led back to people inside the foundation. Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. Several donors stared at the screens in disbelief. Others began reviewing copies that had been distributed moments earlier. For the first time in 25 years, Linda Parker wasn't defending herself. She was proving herself right. Michael attempted to interrupt, but every explanation collapsed beneath another document, another signature, another transfer, another fact. Then Ethan stepped forward. Unlike Linda, he carried no financial records. He carried something else. People. The ballroom doors opened. Several guests entered. Among them was Teresa Martinez. Beside her stood young Diego, now healthier after finally receiving treatment through emergency assistance arranged during the investigation. Frank Delaney entered next. The veteran walked with a prosthetic leg and a determined expression. Several other families followed. Parents, patients, survivors, people whose lives had been directly affected. Ethan faced the audience. "You've seen the numbers." He paused. "Now I'd like you to meet the people behind those numbers." The room became silent. One by one, the families shared their stories. Missed treatments, denied assistance, delayed surgeries, financial ruin, not because help didn't exist, because someone had stolen it. Many guests lowered their eyes. Some wiped away tears. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was human. Michael's face grew pale. For the first time all evening, he looked afraid. Then came the moment nobody expected. Robert Sullivan slowly approached the microphone. A lifetime of leadership had taught him how to command a room without raising his voice. The crowd immediately quieted. Robert looked at his son. The pain in his eyes was impossible to miss. "When I was lying on a Dallas sidewalk during that storm," he said, "I thought my life was ending." He turned toward Ethan, but a young man I had never met stopped to help. The room followed his gaze. "He owed me nothing." Robert paused. "Yet he gave me something priceless." His voice cracked slightly. "A second chance." Several guests looked emotional. Robert continued. "That second chance gave me the opportunity to do what I should have done years ago." Then he faced the cameras. The evidence presented tonight is true. A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. Michael closed his eyes. Robert's next words shattered whatever remained of his defense. My son participated in a system that betrayed the mission this foundation was created to serve. The silence afterward felt endless. Then movement appeared near the rear entrance. Several men and women in dark suits entered the ballroom. FBI agents. Their arrival confirmed what many guests already suspected. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds led the team. A tall man in his 50s with closely cropped gray hair and a serious expression, Reynolds had spent decades investigating financial crimes. His reputation for professionalism was known throughout federal law enforcement. He approached the stage calmly. Michael looked around the room, searching for support. Finding none, the agent presented a warrant. The cameras captured everything. The handcuffs, the stunned expressions, the disbelief. Years of deception collapsed within minutes. As Michael was escorted away, nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The moment felt too tragic, too costly. A family had been destroyed. A foundation had been betrayed. Lives had been damaged. After the arrests, Margaret requested the microphone. The room quieted once more. She turned toward Linda. For a moment, the wealthy philanthropist and the woman once blacklisted by Texas stood facing each other. 25 years of history hung between them. Then Margaret spoke. Linda Parker deserved better. The words echoed across the ballroom. 25 years ago, she told the truth. Tears appeared in Margaret's eyes. And we failed her. The room listened in complete silence. I failed her. Linda lowered her gaze. Margaret continued. On behalf of everyone who ignored her, doubted her, or benefited from that silence, I am sorry. No one spoke. Many couldn't, because everyone understood how long that apology had taken. 1 year later, Ethan Parker walked across the graduation stage and received his medical degree. The investigation against him had been dismissed completely. Dr. Samuel Green shook his hand proudly. Dr. Parker, he said. The title felt surreal. Months later, Ethan began working in emergency medicine. Meanwhile, the reorganized Sullivan Foundation created the Linda Parker Scholarship, dedicated to students who demonstrated integrity and courage in the face of pressure. The scholarship quickly became one of the most respected programs in Texas. On the anniversary of the gala, a reporter asked Robert Sullivan what had changed everything. The elderly businessman smiled. His answer never changed. It started with a storm. He glanced toward Ethan. A young man saw two strangers in trouble and decided to stop. Robert looked out across the crowd. Most people think history changes because of powerful people. He shook his head. Sometimes it changes because one ordinary person chooses to do the right thing.